On Saturday, July 15, 1944, as World War II entered its most decisive and irreversible phase in Western Europe, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel lay wounded in a German military hospital, his staff car shattered days earlier by an Allied fighter bomber on a Norman road. The date matters because by mid-July 1944, the war Rommel had once believed could be shaped by operational brilliance alone had become something else entirely, a political catastrophe tied inseparably to Adolf Hitler's personal rule. What followed in the final months of Rommel's life was not a sudden act of betrayal, but the culmination of a long, painful reckoning that exposed the real reason he turned against the regime he had once served loyally. Rommel's relationship with Hitler had never been ideological in the way it was for many senior Nazis. From the beginning, his loyalty was professional, not political. He admired Hitler in the early years for restoring Germany's army, funding modernization, and breaking the paralysis imposed after the First World War. In World War II's opening campaigns, Rommel benefited enormously from Hitler's favor, receiving rapid promotion and unusual operational freedom. Yet this relationship was built on utility rather than belief, and that distinction would prove decisive. The transformation began slowly, not with moral outrage, but with military reality. By late 1941, after the initial victories in France and North Africa, Rommel began to recognize patterns that troubled him deeply. Hitler increasingly ignored professional advice, overruled experienced commanders, and treated warfare as an extension of personal will rather than strategic calculation. In World War II, where adaptability determined survival, this rigidity became fatal. Rommel's experience in North Africa sharpened this realization. Commanding the Afrika Korps, he witnessed firsthand how Hitler's obsession with symbolic ground and refusal to authorize withdrawals turned operational setbacks into disasters. Supply shortages, overstretched lines, and unrealistic expectations were met not with adjustment, but with demands for absolute obedience. Rommel's repeated requests for logistical support or strategic flexibility were dismissed or delayed, often with catastrophic consequences. By 1942, Rommel was no longer merely frustrated. He was alarmed. He saw that Germany lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged global war against the combined resources of the Allies. World War II was no longer a contest of daring maneuvers, but a grinding struggle of production, manpower, and logistics. Hitler refused to accept this reality, clinging instead to visions of decisive blows that no longer existed. Rommel's growing disillusionment was intensified by his exposure to the human cost of Hitler's decisions. In North Africa and later in France, he watched experienced divisions destroyed because retreat was forbidden. Soldiers were ordered to hold positions long after they had lost tactical value, dying not for victory, but for ideological stubbornness. For Rommel, a professional soldier shaped by duty to his men, this crossed a line. Unlike many conspirators, Rommel did not begin with a desire to overthrow Hitler. His initial objective was to save Germany from annihilation. By early 1944, he had reached a grim conclusion. The war was lost. The Allied landings in Normandy confirmed what he already knew. World War II had become unwinnable, and continuing it would only guarantee Germany's destruction. Rommel's role in the Atlantic Wall brought his conflict with Hitler into sharp focus. Tasked with defending France against invasion, Rommel argued relentlessly that Germany could not defeat the Allies at the beaches without full control of airspace and rapid armored response. Hitler ignored these assessments, dividing command authority and reserving panzer divisions under his personal control. This fragmentation crippled Germany's response on D-Day. When the invasion came on June 6, 1944, Rommel was proven right in every respect. Allied air power paralyzed movement, delayed reinforcements, and shattered communications. German units fought bravely, but the structural weaknesses Rommel had warned about were exposed immediately. For Rommel, this was the final confirmation that Hitler's leadership was no longer merely flawed, but actively suicidal. The real reason Rommel turned against Hitler was not ideological conversion, but responsibility. He believed that allowing Hitler to continue meant condemning Germany to needless annihilation. World War II had reached a point where loyalty to the state and loyalty to Hitler were no longer the same thing. Rommel chose the former. This realization brought Rommel into indirect contact with elements of the German resistance. Officers such as Karl-Heinrich von Stülpnagel and Caesar von Hoffacker approached him cautiously, aware of his immense prestige and moral authority. Rommel did not join assassination plots lightly. He opposed killing Hitler outright, not out of loyalty, but out of fear that assassination would plunge Germany into civil war. Rommel instead advocated arresting Hitler and negotiating peace with the Western Allies. He believed that only his capture could preserve some form of German state and prevent total collapse. In World War II's final year, this position placed Rommel in direct opposition to Hitler's worldview, which demanded absolute victory or total destruction. Rommel's stance reflected his understanding of Allied intentions. He believed Britain and the United States might accept a negotiated surrender if Germany removed Hitler and ended the war in the West. While this assessment underestimated Allied commitment to unconditional surrender, it revealed Rommel's priority: saving lives, not preserving ideology. The injury Rommel suffered on July 17, 1944, removed him physically from command at a critical moment. As he lay recovering, the July 20 plot unfolded without him. When the assassination attempt failed, the regime launched a brutal purge. Under interrogation, several conspirators named Rommel as sympathetic to their aims. This placed Rommel in an impossible position. His popularity made public arrest dangerous for the regime, yet his continued existence was intolerable. Hitler faced a choice: execute Rommel publicly and risk backlash, or eliminate him quietly. World War II had taught the regime how to handle inconvenient heroes. On October 14, 1944, Rommel was offered a choice. He could face trial before the People's Court, where his family would be punished and his reputation destroyed, or he could take poison and receive a state funeral, preserving his family and legacy. The choice itself reveals the regime Rommel had turned against. Rommel chose suicide, not as an act of submission, but as a final attempt to shield his family and preserve some dignity. His death was announced as the result of wounds sustained in service to Germany. World War II ended with millions dead, but Rommel's passing symbolized something else: the destruction of professional integrity by totalitarian rule. The real reason Rommel betrayed Hitler lies in this sequence, not in a single dramatic moment. He did not awaken suddenly to moral clarity. He arrived there through experience, evidence, and responsibility. World War II stripped away illusions, leaving only consequences. Rommel's evolution exposes the limits of charisma and success in authoritarian systems. He had benefited from Hitler's favor, yet that favor demanded obedience even when it contradicted reality. When obedience required sacrificing Germany itself, Rommel refused. His story challenges simplistic narratives of betrayal. Rommel did not betray Germany. He concluded that Hitler had already done so. In World War II, where loyalty was weaponized, distinguishing between the two required courage of a different kind. The tragedy of Rommel's fate lies in timing. Had his realization come earlier, or had others acted with similar authority, history might have unfolded differently. Yet World War II was shaped as much by delay as by action, and Rommel's reckoning came when options were already narrowing. Rommel's experience also reveals the danger of separating military professionalism from political responsibility. He served a criminal regime without confronting its nature until its failures became undeniable. World War II forced that confrontation brutally, and Rommel paid for it with his life. His death did not alter the course of the war, but it illuminated the cost of silence. The real betrayal was not Rommel's turn against Hitler, but the regime's betrayal of the soldiers and civilians it claimed to protect. Rommel's removal exposed a deeper truth about the German command structure in World War II, one that extended far beyond his personal fate. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer an army guided by professional judgment, but an instrument bound tightly to Hitler's personal authority. Field marshals and generals who once debated strategy now competed to demonstrate loyalty, understanding that survival depended less on competence than on obedience. Rommel's absence left a vacuum where dissent had briefly existed, and that vacuum was filled by fear. The response of the German public to Rommel's death also revealed why Hitler had feared confronting him openly. Rommel had become a symbol carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda, the embodiment of honor, bravery, and tactical brilliance. In World War II, where morale was increasingly fragile, symbols mattered. By staging a state funeral and attributing his death to combat injuries, the regime attempted to preserve that symbol while erasing the man who no longer served its purpose. Inside the officer corps, however, the message was unmistakable. Rommel's fate demonstrated that even the most celebrated commander was disposable once he crossed an invisible line. This realization silenced many who privately shared his conclusions about the war's futility. In World War II's final months, resignation replaced resistance, as officers focused on survival rather than intervention. Rommel's reasoning about Germany's strategic position was soon validated by events. The Western Allies broke out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed steadily toward the German border. In the east, Soviet forces advanced relentlessly, crushing entire German armies. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs led to encirclements and mass surrenders, exactly the outcome Rommel had warned against. World War II had become a cascade of irreversible defeats. The question of whether Rommel could have altered history continues to invite debate, but what remains clear is that his opposition emerged from professional responsibility rather than ideological rebellion. He did not suddenly reject nationalism or military service. He rejected a system that demanded sacrifice without purpose. In World War II, that distinction defined the boundary between duty and destruction. Rommel's story also complicates the narrative of resistance within Nazi Germany. Unlike civilian conspirators driven by moral outrage, Rommel's path was shaped by battlefield experience. His opposition was forged not in secret meetings, but in observation of unnecessary loss. World War II forced him to confront the consequences of decisions made far from the front, by a leader insulated from reality. The Atlantic Wall itself stands as a physical manifestation of this conflict. Rommel had attempted to adapt Germany's defenses to modern warfare, emphasizing mobility, forward defense, and rapid reaction. Hitler's interference undermined these efforts, scattering resources and centralizing control. When the Allies landed, the wall did not fail because of lack of effort, but because it reflected political vanity rather than military necessity. Rommel's belief that peace with the Western Allies might be possible also reveals the limits of information within the German High Command. Isolated from diplomatic realities and fed selective intelligence, Rommel underestimated Allied resolve. World War II, shaped by years of total war and atrocity, had hardened positions on all sides. His miscalculation does not diminish his intent, but it highlights how deeply the regime distorted perception. After his death, Rommel's name continued to be used selectively by both sides. Allied commanders acknowledged his skill and professionalism, while post-war narratives often portrayed him as a tragic figure trapped by circumstance. World War II produced few uncomplicated heroes, and Rommel's legacy remains contested precisely because it occupies a gray zone between service and resistance. Yet the core reason for Rommel's break with Hitler remains consistent. He recognized that obedience had become indistinguishable from complicity in national suicide. This recognition did not arise from abstract ethics, but from the cumulative weight of evidence. Each ignored warning, each unnecessary death, each strategic blunder reinforced his conclusion that Germany's leadership had severed itself from reality. Rommel's experience underscores a broader lesson of World War II about the dangers of centralized power unchecked by accountability. When dissent is treated as treason and loyalty is measured by silence, even the most capable institutions collapse. Rommel did not abandon Germany. He attempted, too late, to separate it from the man destroying it. As the war moved toward its violent conclusion in 1945, the choices Rommel faced were imposed on millions of Germans who had far fewer options. Cities were destroyed, armies dissolved, and civilian populations paid the price for decisions made years earlier. World War II ended not with redemption, but with reckoning. confirming the fears Rommel had voiced in his final months. Rommel's story does not resolve comfortably into moral certainty. He served a regime responsible for immense suffering, yet he ultimately recognized its fatal trajectory. World War II leaves little room for clean absolution, but it demands honest examination of responsibility, timing, and consequence. In examining why Rommel turned against Hitler, the answer lies not in a single act of defiance, but in the slow erosion of belief under the pressure of reality. He reached a point where continuing obedience meant endorsing destruction without purpose. That realization, forged in the crucible of World War II, became the quiet turning point that defined his final decisions. The significance of Rommel's choice extends beyond his death. It exposes the cost of delayed resistance and the danger of separating military excellence from moral judgment. World War II demonstrated that skill without accountability can serve catastrophe as efficiently as incompetence. Rommel's legacy endures not because he was flawless, but because his breaking point reveals the human limits of loyalty under tyranny. In a war defined by extremes, his final stance reflects the moment when experience overcame illusion and responsibility eclipsed obedience. The aftermath of Rommel's death also forced a quiet re-evaluation among Allied leaders who had studied him closely throughout World War II. To them, Rommel had been a formidable opponent whose tactical flexibility and willingness to adapt stood in contrast to the rigidity increasingly visible in German command decisions. His removal from the battlefield confirmed what many Allied intelligence officers already suspected. Germany was losing not only men and materiel, but its most capable independent thinkers. In Germany itself, Rommel's forced silence removed a potential bridge between military reality and political decision-making. Other commanders, observing what had happened, adjusted their behavior accordingly. Reports became more optimistic, casualty figures were softened, and strategic assessments were framed to align with Hitler's expectations. World War II, at this stage, was no longer fought with honest evaluations, but with carefully crafted illusions designed to avoid punishment. Rommel's earlier warnings about Normandy gained renewed significance as the Western Allies advanced into France. His insistence that armored reserves be positioned close to the beaches had been overruled in favor of centralized control. When those reserves were finally released, Allied air superiority rendered them ineffective. The outcome validated Rommel's operational logic and exposed the fatal consequences of Hitler's interference, a pattern repeated across multiple theaters of World War II. The contrast between Rommel's approach and Hitler's leadership style became increasingly stark. Rommel believed war demanded constant reassessment, flexibility, and acceptance of unfavorable realities. Hitler demanded unwavering faith in his intuition, even when evidence contradicted it. In World War II, this divergence was not merely philosophical. It translated directly into lives lost and opportunities squandered. Rommel's personal transformation also reflected the broader psychological toll of prolonged warfare. Years of command had stripped away the early optimism that had accompanied Germany's initial victories. Exposure to defeat, civilian suffering, and the scale of destruction reshaped his understanding of duty. World War II was no longer a contest of maneuver and skill, but a grinding catastrophe without a viable end. The German resistance movement, fragmented and isolated, recognized Rommel's potential value precisely because of his reputation. His participation, even indirectly, could have legitimized opposition within the army. Hitler's decision to eliminate him quietly rather than publicly revealed how dangerous that legitimacy might have been. In World War II, perception often mattered as much as action, and Rommel's image carried weight beyond his actual authority. Rommel's death also highlighted the limits of individual influence within a totalitarian system. Despite his rank and fame, he could not overcome a structure designed to suppress dissent. World War II demonstrated repeatedly that centralized authoritarian control could mobilize resources rapidly, but it struggled to correct itself once errors compounded. As Germany's situation deteriorated further, the absence of voices like Rommel's became more pronounced. Strategic decisions increasingly favored symbolic resistance over practical defense. Cities were declared fortresses, retreats forbidden, and armies ordered to fight to destruction. World War II's final phase in Europe unfolded less as a campaign of strategy and more as a sequence of enforced sacrifices. Rommel's relationship with his soldiers also distinguished him from many contemporaries. He was known for visiting front lines, observing conditions firsthand, and responding to immediate realities rather than abstract directives. This connection to the battlefield shaped his conclusions about the war's trajectory. In World War II, leaders who remained physically and psychologically distant from combat were more likely to cling to illusion. The ethical dimension of Rommel's decisions remains inseparable from the context in which he operated. He was neither a revolutionary nor a pacifist, but a professional officer confronting the collapse of rational command. World War II placed individuals like Rommel in positions where traditional concepts of loyalty conflicted with survival and responsibility. Post-war interpretations of Rommel often reflect the needs of later generations rather than the complexities of his time. Some portray him as a symbol of a clean Wehrmacht, while others emphasize his service to a criminal regime. World War II resists such simplifications, and Rommel's life illustrates how competence, ambition, and conscience can coexist uneasily. The circumstances of Rommel's death also underscore how the Nazi regime managed dissent through controlled narratives. By honoring him publicly while silencing the truth, Hitler sought to maintain cohesion during collapse. World War II's propaganda battles were fought not only against enemies, but against internal doubt. Rommel's final months reveal a man caught between obligation and foresight. He understood that Germany could not win, yet lacked a clear path to alter its course without plunging the nation into chaos. World War II offered no easy exits, only diminishing choices shaped by earlier decisions. The broader implication of Rommel's story lies in how institutions respond to inconvenient truth. When systems punish accuracy and reward compliance, they accelerate their own failure. World War II provides numerous examples of this dynamic. But Rommel's experience captures it with particular clarity. As Allied forces closed in on Germany, the war entered its terminal phase, characterized by destruction disproportionate to any remaining strategic value. Rommel had foreseen this outcome and sought to avert it, not through surrender alone, but through recognition of reality. World War II's end confirmed that denial had prolonged suffering without altering the result. Rommel's legacy, therefore, is not defined solely by his battlefield achievements, but by the moment he recognized the limits of obedience. His decision to step away from Hitler's authority, even quietly, marked a rupture between professional duty and ideological loyalty. World War II forced that rupture upon many, but few faced it as visibly or as perilously as Rommel. In tracing the real reason Rommel turned against Hitler, the answer emerges through accumulation rather than revelation. Each failed order, each ignored warning, and each unnecessary death reinforced his conclusion that the war had become detached from purpose. World War II, in its final analysis, punished those who refused to adapt and destroyed those who spoke too late. The consequences of Rommel's removal continued to ripple through the German military as World War II approached its conclusion. Without his moderating influence, command decisions became increasingly extreme, shaped by ideological stubbornness rather than battlefield logic. Orders to hold territory at any cost multiplied, even when supply lines had collapsed and units no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The gap between maps in headquarters and reality at the front widened until strategy itself became a fiction. Among junior officers and enlisted soldiers, Rommel's fate circulated as an unspoken warning. His career had demonstrated that excellence and loyalty were no longer sufficient protections. In World War II's final phase, initiative became dangerous, and silence became a survival strategy. This atmosphere accelerated the Wehrmacht's paralysis, as commanders waited for instructions that either arrived too late or defied physical possibility. Rommel's earlier insistence on preparing for Allied air dominance also gained retrospective clarity. He had argued that modern warfare required decentralization, rapid response, and acceptance of technological disadvantage. Hitler's refusal to accept these premises left German forces rigid and exposed. World War II increasingly favored adaptability over bravado, and Germany's command structure proved incapable of that shift. The moral isolation Rommel experienced in his final months mirrored the isolation of Germany itself. Cut off diplomatically, surrounded militarily, and consumed internally by fear, the nation followed a trajectory that Rommel had recognized but could not redirect. World War II punished not only aggression, but inflexibility, and Germany embodied both by 1944. Rommel's interactions with other officers during this period further illustrate the erosion of trust within the high command. Conversations became guarded, meetings carefully scripted, and genuine debate nearly impossible. World War II, which had begun with rapid coordination and decisive action, ended for Germany in suspicion and fragmentation. The strategic collapse that followed Rommel's death validated his belief that Germany's remaining strength lay not in defiance, but in minimizing destruction. His recognition that the war's outcome was settled did not stem from defeatism, but from assessment. World War II had reached a stage where prolonging combat no longer served national defense, only ideological fixation. Rommel's story also highlights how personal loyalty to Hitler had replaced institutional loyalty to the German state. Officers were compelled to swear allegiance to an individual rather than a constitution or nation. In World War II, this distinction proved catastrophic, as it subordinated collective survival to personal authority. As Allied troops crossed into German territory, the absence of pragmatic leadership became stark. Opportunities for organized withdrawal or negotiated surrender were missed, not because they were impossible, but because they were forbidden. World War II's final battles in Europe were shaped less by necessity than by prohibition. Rommel's belief that Germany's enemies might distinguish between the regime and the nation underestimated the totalizing nature of World War II. The scale of destruction and ideological polarization had eliminated space for partial resolutions. His hope reflected a soldier's logic rather than a political reality forged by years of uncompromising war. The internal collapse of Germany's military institutions after Rommel's death also demonstrates how authoritarian systems devour their own competence. By eliminating those who questioned strategy, the regime ensured that only affirmation remained. World War II thus exposed the fatal weakness beneath the appearance of absolute control. Rommel's legacy persisted quietly among those who survived the war. Some remembered him as a commander who cared for his troops, others as a symbol of professionalism trapped within a criminal system. World War II left room for neither uncomplicated condemnation nor uncritical admiration, and Rommel's memory occupies that uneasy space. The silence surrounding Rommel's true end endured for years, shaped by political needs during Reconstruction and the early Cold War. His image was adapted to serve narratives of reconciliation and division alike. World War II's aftermath did not end debates about responsibility, it merely relocated them. Rommel's final realization that loyalty without accountability becomes destructive remains one of the war's enduring lessons. He did not rebel openly, nor did he fully extricate himself from the system he served. World War II forced him into a narrow corridor between resistance and obedience, where choices carried irreversible consequences. In this sense, Rommel's turning point was less a betrayal of Hitler than a confrontation with reality. He recognized that continued compliance meant participation in ruin. World War II, with its scale and brutality, stripped away illusions that might have survived in lesser conflicts. The broader tragedy of Rommel's story lies in timing. His clarity emerged when options had already narrowed to extremes. World War II rewarded early adaptation and punished delayed reckoning, and Rommel's insight arrived after the machinery of war had become unstoppable. Yet his experience remains instructive precisely because it illustrates how professional integrity can erode under sustained pressure. Rommel's journey from celebrated commander to silenced dissenter reflects the corrosive effect of absolute power on rational decision-making. World War II stands as the context that revealed, rather than created, this vulnerability. As Europe lay in ruins and the war drew to a close, Rommel's absence symbolized the cost of silencing inconvenient truth. His fate did not change the outcome, but it clarified why that outcome became inevitable. World War II ended not only through military defeat, but through the collapse of systems that refused to listen until listening no longer mattered. Rommel's break with Hitler, therefore, was not a single dramatic act, but the final stage of disillusionment born from experience. He turned not because of conspiracy alone, but because reality overwhelmed ideology. In the relentless logic of World War II, that realization came too late to save Germany, but early enough to define his legacy.